Right, good morning. It's interesting in the morning coming on following the preliminary session about the Spark because we've done a similar event for our members, Chartered Association of Building Engineers, at Southampton Solent using the Spark facility. And to be honest, this is a very comparable facility in terms of what we've got here. So, good morning, my name's Kevin Blunden. I'm the Technical Director at the Chartered Association of Building Engineers. And today I'm going to talk to you about the balance between quality and performance and some of the challenges that are facing the sector at present. And in doing that, I'm going to refer to a couple of recent reports and publications. One published by the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Excellence in the Built Environment, which is entitled More Homes and Fewer Complaints, and the Bonfield report, as it's commonly known, Each Home Counts, which deals particularly with energy and sustainability issues. But both of them have significant concerns about consumer protection, quality of build, and the performance, if you like, of the construction sector. So I'm going to try and go through some of that in a brief sort of 40-45 minutes to paint a picture of where we are and perhaps what we need to do going forward. So I suppose the first thing we need to think about when we're talking about quality is how do we measure quality? What is quality? Where's the perception of it come from? Is it about, as we've just seen, the quality of the finished product in terms of impact and promotion of an organisation and the standing and the finish of the design? Is it about the spatial requirements? Is it about the physical performance against measured standards? Do we have to look at it in terms of the overall sustainability picture? Or I think, as is quite often the case when we start talking about quality, what we actually boil down to is, are we actually hitting a minimum level of compliance? And it's perhaps a little bit of a sad reflection that a lot of the time, get that to move, when we start talking about quality and performance, we end up starting to actually think about, well, what's the minimum we can get away with? We've got a limited budget and we've got to provide something, so what's the minimum we can do in terms of quality? And one of the big concerns, particularly about the All-Party Parliamentary Group document on the quality of new homes and reducing the number of complaints, is as we have targets for building more and more new buildings, and particularly new dwellings, how do we manage that volume build over a relatively short space of time whilst trying to improve the quality of what we're looking for at the same time? And there are a lot of proposals in both of those reports on how we can try and address quality and try and improve things in the industry as we move forward. But one of the big problems I come across, and working with the Chartered Association of Building Engineers, we have roughly 50% of our members working in building control or dealing with building regs, and the rest of them really are designers or consultants who get involved with having to implement and design to those standards. And one of the big problems I tend to see is that when we look at the majority of designs that are submitted, and we're not talking now the blue chip type projects and the one-offs, we're talking the run-of-the-mill day-to-day building products in our sector. What people actually aim for is to achieve the minimum level of statutory compliance. We have building regulations, we have British standards, and people aim to design to meet the minimum requirement of that standard. There's never any expectation of trying to do something better. So we have some outstanding practices who will then set a best practice for the industry. But the bulk of what we build, particularly in the housing sector, falls down to what is it that we can do, that we have to do, that we don't necessarily have to add anything else to. And every time in this country when we consult on improving standards within the regulatory framework, quite often during that consultation process, the large developers, the large house builders, are the ones who are saying, whoa, we can't do any of this, it's going to cost us a fortune. I'm old enough that I can still remember when accessibility to new homes came into the building regulations, probably about 30 years ago. Although if you listen to Maria Miller MP in the run-up to the election, she was still saying perhaps it's something we should do going forward, even though it's been with us for a very long time. But at that time, one of the big proposals was to change the width of the front door on the house to enable a wheelchair user to get in. And I can still remember the house builders saying, whoa, that's a non-standard size, that's going to cost us a fortune on all these houses we're building, we can't possibly make this change. Well, obviously we did move forward with it because the stock size of door just changed, but there is a reluctance to do for anything more than the absolute minimum. And the problem with that is, if you set yourself a target of the minimum, all you're ever going to do is fail, because you might hit the target, but more often than not you won't quite. And if you aim for something better and you don't quite hit it, then that's fine, you probably still comply. But if you aim for the minimum, more often than not you're going to fail to hit that standard. And I think where the big concern is at the moment is that the gap between the statutory requirements we have and the expectation of the end user and the client is growing. In the 1950s or the 1960s, if somebody took ownership of a new property, they expected that over the next few months, as it dried out, and then over the next winter and summer, the property would move a bit and you'd get the odd bit of cracking, and they accepted the fact that they would go in and put a bit of polyfiller in and get it back to a usable state after a period of time. Now, clients expect perfection at day one, and they expect it to maintain that going forward. So there's a higher level of expectation from the client. So there's a body of work to do about quality. Not only do we have to look at where are we aiming to be, but we also have to look at managing the client expectation in the first instance. So as I've said, we've got these two reports that have come out in recent times, both of which are changing drivers to practices and eventually to legislation going forward in terms of how we set up the industry and how we're going to try and improve the situation. So what are we actually seeing in terms of statistics in terms of new build? Well, roughly 1 in 3 of new homeowners feel dissatisfied with what they've got within the first 2 years. 2015, Homeowners Alliance said that actually the majority of people prefer to buy a slightly older property because it's likely to have less problems with it. And a YouGov survey showed only 21% would opt for a new build, whereas 47% would prefer a home built over a decade ago. And that's a bit of a damning statement. It's part of the legacy of what we have in the UK, because we expect homes to last for longer, so people are more used to living in older buildings. But surely, you couldn't translate this into the new car market. How many purchasers of a new car would say, I'd rather be driving a 10-year-old car than a brand new one? Just doesn't equate. So somewhere we're missing the trick in terms of the quality. There's no doubt one of the big problems we've got is about the people we've got involved in the sector. And we are losing skills at the craft side of the industry, but also in the professional side of the industry. We've seen a large number or a large drop in skilled workers in the sector. A lot of people who left the sector 6, 7, 8 years ago when we started to see harder times haven't necessarily returned, and we have tended to fill the gap with migrant workers. But now, with the uncertainty about the EU, we're starting to see less of that occurring. There is a drop in qualified professionals. Today there are 3, 4, 5 professional bodies here represented, and all of them will tell you that the bulk of their members sit in that bracket between sort of 47 and 63. That's where most of them will sit. And we would have seen a greater drop in the number of professionals in the sector had it not been for the fact that we're also seeing people working longer. So those people who would have dropped out at 60 are working to 70 and beyond. So it sort of masks the fact that we've got a big issue. And the number of people coming out of the universities and colleges to feed the bottom end of that train is just not sufficient at the moment to make up for the gap that we're going to have. And there's no doubt 5, 10 years time we're going to have serious issues about the number of professionals we've got within the sector. We've also got a changing field for those people. We heard this morning from the President-elect of SIAT talk about collaboration in the industry. And there's no doubt that actually the professionals that we'll have in 10 years' time will be doing different roles, and they'll be calling themselves something different, and there'll be more of an overlap. I'm standing here quite smugly for CABE, because when we got our Royal Charter 3 years ago, our unique definition of what a building engineer is somebody who designs, constructs, evaluates or maintains buildings. Now, as far as I'm concerned, that's everybody in the sector. It's everybody in this room, that's for sure. So my potential membership is huge. But there will be a lot more overlap and collaboration. And at some stage, we may well see that some bodies merge and align. Indeed, there have been some independent reports to suggest that that should be the way forward. And I think, if anything, BIM's probably driving us that way. So we have to look at the skills and the training. And it is very difficult. As I say, a lot of our members work in building control. I cannot point any of you today at a university degree that covers building control and building regulations. People do general surveying or built environment qualifications and then bolt on a bit of specific training. And the same applies to a lot of the issues and the skills across the sector. And part of the government's suggested solution with this skills training and quality issue is that we move to off-site construction and produce buildings in the factory under conditions where we can improve the workmanship and the quality. And we saw a bit of that in the example with the Spark at Solent this morning, with the external panels just being lifted into space and bolted together already glazed. So it can improve the process. The problem is we have to learn from the past, because it's all well and good about talking about modular construction and off-site construction now. Let's not, whatever we do, call it prefab, because we've been there, done that, and it hasn't really worked. So we've got to make sure it works properly as we move forward. So there is concern about the standard of workmanship, and there's concern about not only the standard of workmanship, and are we looking at materials that are correct, are they being installed properly, but also who's looking at the standard of workmanship. Now, I'm not here from the Institute of Clerk of Works and Construction Inspectorate, but 30, 40 years ago, most major jobs had a Clerk of Works there looking at the building from the client's perspective all the way through. And we just don't see that anymore. So who is doing it? Is it a supervising designer who's there on site? Is it a resident engineer? Or is it the warranty provider, or maybe building control? Or is most of this stuff actually left to the site agent to determine how good this job is going to be? So there is a lot of concern as well at the moment about warranties, and one of the recommendations of these reports is to review the warranty system, because there's a lot of misconception about what a building warranty is actually doing, particularly for new build housing. People assume they buy a house, it's got a warranty, anything goes wrong, it's covered. Any of you who've bought a new house will know one of the reasons that people are reluctant to buy them is within the first 2 years you've got a reasonable chance of getting things covered by the original builder. From 2 years to 8 years, when it then falls over to the warranty provider to actually deal with anything, they are really only going to deal with major structural issues. And a lot of those latent defects that perhaps don't show themselves so early in the building's life don't necessarily get covered. So there's some lack of trust in the warranty system, there's a lack of understanding of what it covers, and there's perhaps a need for a better sort of quality to this whole thing. I am a little bit nervous because the recommendations of one of these reports says we should have another quality mark for building. Now, we already have several schemes that provide quality type marks for building. We don't need to invent another one unless it's going to combine the others or be significantly more relevant and actually work. Otherwise we just confuse the sector with lots of different marks that somebody might say applies. One of the key issues then is about communication. To get the quality of the build right, not only do we have to educate the client about what they're going to get and what they should expect, but we need communication between the parties involved in the process. And this is where BIM is starting to have an impact on those projects where we're using it, predominantly the public funded or the larger projects. And it does mean that we get to ideally not only just avoiding clashes in construction and some wastage, but we do get to actually communicate and get to a better and more efficient and a better quality design. The only problem with the BIM processes at the moment is there's still a lot of concern about how scalable it is to the small and medium enterprises and how it will work on those smaller jobs. So we need to improve communication so that the concept that somebody has that can end up at the edge of the project looking like the real building actually does get translated to that and doesn't get lost somewhere in between, and the pods ends up looking totally different because it wasn't quite explained as it went through the process. Part of where we are with quality and performance of buildings always comes down to the professionals who are involved. And most professional bodies, and certainly those represented here today, have within their codes of conduct requirements of those professionals to avoid danger to health and safety and to avoid adverse impact on the environment. And that's in most of the codes of conduct that are there as well. And again, all of the bodies here today have signed up to an international coalition standard on ethical responsibility, which deals with some of the issues about communication with the client and practices within the industry, all of which will help to improve. I tend to focus on some key areas. So these are the codes, if you like, that apply to the building control sector, because building control do make inspections on site, so they do have an input into this performance and maybe quality issue, it's debatable. But all of the professional bodies dealing with that sector have their own code of conduct. In addition, building control, if it's private sector, is regulated by a CIC AIR, which has another code of conduct that applies to the private sector building control. And LABC, who have a standout here today, have introduced their own voluntary code for their members as well. So actually, the professionals in that sector probably have more governance to them than anybody else. But part of the problem with that, particularly in terms of building regulations, is the issue of how we get a qualification. At the moment, we are very much filling building control roles in terms of inspecting for minimum standards with people transferring from the craft side or from site management into the sector. When building control started in the 1950s and 60s, that's where it came from. It came from the trades, and you converted somebody over across from site supervision. We went through a phase where the professional bodies introduced their own examination profiles and courses through the colleges. Then we went to degree entry, and now we've sort of reverted back as of necessity. But the problem is it's filling a void. There are people out there doing the inspection role who are only capable of looking at certain elements, things like drainage inspections or foundations. There's also, unfortunately, quite a big volume of building control professionals, I might use professional loosely, who go on site armed with one of these because they're not really sure what they're looking at, take the photo, send it to a colleague, ask them, do you think that's right? Because we are pushing people to the limits of their competence. And that's a bit of a worry. The other issue is that the building regulations, those minimum standards, are getting more and more complex. Now, having worked in building control, I'm reasonably happy that we're not where we are 15 years ago when the government was saying we'll get rid of building regulations. But now, the idea is that everything we can, we will put into building regulations. I don't know how familiar you may be, but the latest regulations that came in January were about whether or not you can have high-speed broadband in a property, and all it actually involves is a specification note to say you can get more than 30 megabits a second on your plan, and inspection-wise just checking there's a plastic plate on the wall at completion, and no more than that. And it's just making life more and more complicated. The other thing is, people complain that the building control process for statutory control doesn't actually do very much. You don't get many visits, it's not really a quality inspection, but that's because of where it sits now. The minimum number of inspections on any one property for compliance with building regulations is 1. The typical fee for the inspection element of a new house is £400, and it will be less than that if it's one of a very large development. Okay. By the time you take a salary and on costs and your national insurance and your admin staff and all the rest of it, you might, if you're remote from where the site is, get 5 or 6 inspections if you're lucky. So you're not going to see all of those areas or elements during the job where something might go wrong. It's a spot check at best. And as a result, there are some building control bodies whose view is they go on site, they identify something that doesn't comply and that is a fault with the property, they advise the site agent, and that is it. They have done their job. They are not obliged to go back and recheck and see if it's been put right. And that's a bit of a worry, because 20, 30 years ago they would have been going back to double check. So these reports, what are they actually saying to us? Well, the all-party parliamentary group basically says there's about 10 recommendations within it. The first one is that we should have a new homes ombudsman. Is that going to improve quality? I don't know, but it's to give mediation between the consumer and the developer, because one of the issues we find is that consumers end up in long protracted discussions and debates about whether or not their building is suitable. Also a recommendation that we have standardised house building contracts so that each developer doesn't have their own, in plain English, so that the public can understand what they're actually buying and what the exclusion clauses are and what's covered and what's not. There's also a request that the government department responsible for building regs reviews the warranty system. Now, one of the reasons that the public are confused at the moment is that some of the bodies who do building control also do warranties for buildings, and the public are confused about which bit are they inspecting at which time and what covers what. Theoretically, the rules for building control say you should not do anything else as well as building control. So those organisations that do actually are 2 separate companies, but sometimes they may be 2 separate companies doing building control and warranty, but it's one person on site doing the 2 inspections, and that needs looking at and reviewing. Again, what is the right standard of level of inspection that's needed, and how do we actually get it right, and how do we communicate that it's paid for properly? And then there's recommendations about consumer rights generally. There's also a plea to the house builders that they adopt a quality culture, looking at things like ISO standards. It's always difficult with things like ISO standards, because you can get ISO certification for following a process, even if the process delivers something that's rubbish. If my standard says I'm always going to deliver something rubbish and I'll be consistent in doing it, you can get ISO approved for that. So it's about the quality culture more than getting the rubber stamp of the standard. And they're also trying to suggest most house builders do customer surveys, but what they're looking for is actually more evidence that they take on board the feedback from those surveys to feed into the future construction. The other report, the Each Home Counts report, suggests that maybe we should have a new quality mark to sit along Build Mark and Trust Mark and everything else we've got, certified by an approved body. And within that, to establish that you could issue that or have that quality mark label, you would need to abide by a code of conduct, a code of practice, and a new consumer charter. So it all sounds good. It's getting the buy-in from everybody that's difficult to all this stuff. There's also suggestion that we need to give better advice and guidance to the end users. We need to review the standards, we need to look at training, and a need to look at compliance and enforcement. The focus on Each Home Counts is on sustainability and energy, and there has been quite a lot of criticism in the sort of compliance and enforcement market that people don't actually enforce energy parts of legislation because it's not health and safety. Nobody's going to die if their building's a bit drafty. Okay, but there are some serious concerns about some of the regulations we have and how we work. You'll have probably read in the trade press that there's a lot of work being done on testing and looking into indoor air quality, because as we've improved the energy performance of buildings, we've made them more and more airtight, and as a result there are concerns about indoor air quality. Some of that might be that the standard is a bit too tight as it is at the moment, but some of it might also be that nobody's giving the advice and the guidance to the end user on what they should do with their ventilation system. An awful lot of householders flick off the isolator switch over the ensuite bathroom door because if they use the toilet in the middle of the night, they don't want the fan coming on to wake everybody in the house up. And they need to understand that that's a process. Some of the other things that are in legislation, although they're there, they don't get done. There is a building regulation that requires that every extract fan that gets put into a new building is tested to show that it achieves the extract rate it's supposed to, and a certificate is given to building control to prove that. Yesterday I was teaching to an audience of about 20 building control new entrants, and I do this on a regular basis every 4 weeks. And I always ask them as an audience, have you ever seen a test certificate for a fan? Now bear in mind this has been in requirement since 2010. I have never yet come across anybody who has seen a test certificate for a fan. So the worry is, if we're expecting a fan to extract at 30 litres a second, but somebody connects it to a bit of flexi duct that's going between the joists and around the houses and through a really stupid louver on the outside, it's not achieving the ventilation we need to. So it's not necessarily just about having the right regulations and the standards, it's also about how we actually enforce and use those. The other one I would cite in terms of energy is there's a requirement to air pressure test your property. Your brand new property has to have an air leakage test. And it's allowable under the guidance to the building regs that on a site with multiple houses you can sample test. So as long as you test each house type and you test several of each house type, you don't have to test each one. But what it also says in the guidance is if somebody tests one and it doesn't achieve the standard you were looking for, then they go in and apply retrofit measures to make it airtight and retest it. But what should happen is they should then look at all the other untested ones of the same house type and look to see if they need to do those same measures and maybe test a few more to see if it works or not. That never happens, because what happens is the air tester turns up on site, he's employed by the developer. If it fails the air leakage test for building regs, they say, oh well, that wasn't an air leakage test, that was just a pre-leak test to see how well we'd done. We'll fix that property, can you test it again this afternoon? It passes and nobody ever knows that it failed, and the remedial works on all those other properties that weren't tested don't get done. So there's a lot of things we can do to smarten up the industry and pick onto the standards we've actually got at the moment to make sure it works. One of the big issues coming out of these documents is that people don't understand what building control does. And I've got to be honest, before I worked for the association, I used to work in building control for 25 years and nobody knew what I did. You know, unless they were having an extension built, nobody even knew you existed. The most they thought about in terms of control was maybe what planning look at. So there is confusion about what building control do. There's confusion about the difference between building regulations, building control and a warranty. And a lot of the complaints that come through from consumers are about building control not covering elements that don't fall within their remit, about the finish, the quality of workmanship. Building regulations do cover workmanship, but only to the extent where if the workmanship is that bad, the element doesn't perform. So your brickwork wall can have its joints and its perps and all over the place. As long as it stays up, that's good enough. The quality issue isn't that far within the building control remit. But one of the suggestions out of these documentation is that going forward it will be. What we've had from government so far is there is a role for building control in quality. They haven't yet defined what that role is, but that's what they're telling us. But the public think building control is a clerk of works function. They also think it deals with aesthetics and appearance, and ultimately because there's an enforcement role to it, they tend to think that it's going to be a sort of an arbitration service at the end of the day. And I think that The biggest misconception about building control and building regulations is it's some guarantee of compliance. I am absolutely astounded that the legal sector and the financial sector accept completion certificates from building control at the moment as evidence that work complies. Because the wording on completion certificates from building regulations at the moment is that the certificate is evidence, but not conclusive evidence, that the work complies with building regs. Now, where else would you lend money on something where you're told, well, it's not conclusive evidence that it's okay? And I think there is a lot of work to do to smarten up the sector. So we've looked at the performance and of the system in terms of building control and professionals. In the private sector, the companies licensed to do building control have to have about 85% of their staff professionally qualified, and they have to demonstrate that they are carrying out continuing professional development beyond that. So that's quite heavily regulated. It doesn't quite apply the same way in the public sector. But building control are supposed to take all reasonable steps to ensure that work complies. What they're going to be asked to do from now on, and this is coming in as of now, is that building control will have an inspection template, and the building control inspection records for a new house will be passed on to the owner on completion of the premises. Now, up until now, if you'd wanted to see the building control records and notes relating to any project, they'd have said, oh no, can't show you those. Oh no, they're ours, they're confidential. There's probably, all sorts of issues in terms of data protection, freedom of information. No, you can't have them. Going forward, it will be part of that pack that goes to the end user, so that it will identify what inspections were made, what defects were identified, whether or not those were checked to see if they've been cleared off. And it will pick up then the whole package of how that property was dealt with. Okay. Part of this is then also to say, well, do we need to have an element of responsibility in terms of what that inspection is doing and how we're actually trying to achieve this level of compliance and how we're trying to move it forward. So we're looking at inspection, but also we're trying to say that house builders have to take a degree of responsibility for how they're actually building things. They shouldn't rely on third party. And indeed, under the building regs, it's the person carrying out the work who's responsible.
Just a quick question.
Yeah.
You talked about the template for house builders. Is that going to be the same for commercial developments as well?
At the moment, no. But I would say within the next 3 to 5 years, yes.
Right.
There's a lot of detailed work on a template of inspection and how much information you give to people, because the trouble is, the worry is, if you say to somebody you've got to give you the record of inspection, what happens is what goes into that record becomes a little bit more innocuous, because you don't want to commit to writing anything that might hang you later on. When I started, I worked on the south coast. If you went and looked at foundation and you looked at the ground condition, most of the site notes said sandy loam, some stone content. Okay, because at the end of the day, if somebody had a problem later on and dug a trial hole to see what it was, that pretty much covered everything you would come across in that locality. And there's a worry that if you say people have got to give their notes to somebody, then the notes don't tell you very much, and they're perhaps not as detailed as you would expect otherwise. So there is work being done on this template. There is no doubt that what happens in the domestic sector will cascade on. If it's right for a domestic client, it's got to be right for a commercial client. In fact, possibly more so, because the commercial client is probably closer linked to the building regulation process. In mass house building, there's a discontinuity between building control and the end user, because building control is working with the developer all the way through, and it's basically the developer who's paying their fees. So the end user is that one stage remote. In the commercial sector, more often than not, the client is the one who's directly in communication with building control at the start of the process. So, at the end of the day, building control is a competitive marketplace between the private sector and the public sector. So if a client says, well, you can have the job, but I want to see all your records, that's what's going to happen. And it will follow through.
I thought it said that you only have to provide your records if it's requested by the client. And are you talking about the new performance standards that's come in?
The new performance standard says if it's requested, but that's a transitional phase to it being provided every time.
Because it doesn't differentiate between domestic and commercial either, does it?
No, I'll touch on that in a minute, but performance standards require building control to do certain things, and yes, have the records available doesn't differentiate. So what's going to be in the buyer's information pack for dwellings, it's going to be details about that. The critical thing, actually what regulations applied. The vast majority of new build housing being built at the moment, in terms of this report and energy and sustainability, is still being built to the 2010 building regulations rather than the 2013 building regs. Because when the regulations change, people are told if you get your application in before the date that it comes in and you start work on site or make a token start within 12 months, you can carry on to the old standard. So a lot of buildings are still being built to older standards of requirement. And if you buy a new building built today, you don't actually at the moment know which standard it was designed to. So it's important. And then details of who's done the inspection work, when, what happened to someone. A little bit nervous that we may have a fire alarm, but he's testing the detectors out there. So a lot more information. Building control, yes, they have a national group called BCP-SAG, Building Control Performance Standards Advisory Group, who advise a committee who advise government on what the right level of performance within building control is, and the performance standards set certain elements that building control have to do. So the first is that they've got enough qualified staff to do the work they take on. Now that's always difficult. The private sector can restrict how much work it takes on, it just turns down contracts. The public sector has to take everything that comes through the door. So they have to have sufficient resource to carry out their work. Now we are looking at a plan up front of what the inspection regime will be, based upon the risk of the building, where the non-compliance might be, and who's doing the work. Okay. We're also looking at records to be maintained to show who was doing the work, what's going on, what inspections were made, and recording what's happening. Okay. And that will include what are suggested stages that you might want to consider for inspection, although they will vary for the job depending on the complexity of the job. So there's a lot of stuff about the information in the records. In addition to what's passed on, building control bodies have to keep their records for at least 15 years themselves. Okay, in a format that is retrievable, which sometimes can be challenging if you change databases. And then there's ethical standards to maintain. There's the whole concept of how do building control win the work, and it shouldn't be on interpretation of building regs. I've had people come to me and say, you know, you can have my building control project if you won't ask for sprinklers, and clearly that shouldn't be the process that we're doing. But because we've got private and public sector, you will get differences in interpretation. As I said earlier on, the professional bodies in the sector now, that's now moved, I think they've now hit 120 bodies globally have signed up to this International Ethical Standards Coalition, which is there designed for people to make sure that they have professional conduct in their dealing with the clients and with other professionals, that they only do work that they're competent to do, and that they take the responsibility for the work not only they do but the work that's done under their supervision.
I notice you're not listing CIAT on that.
I'm not sure. I'm fairly sure they have signed up to it. It's just not one that's on my radar.
Signed up to it as well.
Yeah,
so,
I'm fairly sure they are. To be fair, it's probably because that part of the slide was aimed at building control, and CIAT still isn't a mainstream body into building control.
Right.
But I'm sure you're right. I'm sure they've signed up to it. So that's our bits of our code of conduct, which reflects some of that stuff and was on the earlier slides. CIB, very similar in terms of competence. RICS, at the time I looked at their website, it was down for maintenance, but the same thing is there. So all of the professional sector has the same sort of obligations and responsibility on the people there to try and provide the professional side of the service. What we've now got to do as professionals is decide over the next 2-3 years how we're actually going to interpret this and turn it into better quality buildings. Because as soon as we get back after this election today and they settle down and then they have a summer holiday and then we get to the autumn, then they might start thinking about some of these things again and start saying, how are we going to improve the quality of buildings? I think the first step for dwellings will be to separate that warranty process from the building control process so that it's seen as an independent quality mark.
Excuse me, assuming there's a failure in a building and everybody opts out of accepting responsibility, doesn't the building insurer pick up the tab? And so will the building insurers ultimately be a driver on this?
Realistically, if there's a problem with the property as a new build, all new dwellings have to have a warranty. So the insurer will just punt it back to the warranty provider. They won't carry the can for a construction issue that has a latent defect as a result of the construction. They may assist the client on occasion in pursuing the developer, but they're more likely to just wash their hands of it at that stage because it's covered by the warranty. It's outside the scope of their insurance, if you like.
And when it's out of warranty?
When it's out of warranty, then the insurers take the can. And quite often, the one driver for doing something than the minimum compliance standard that I talked about right at the beginning is the insurance sector. And you see it most in things like fire, where insurers will ask for a higher standard protection or maybe the provision of sprinklers that aren't required under regulations, but they are there to mitigate their risk. They also have the other flip side of things. We see the problem with properties recovering from flood, that insurers are loath to go in and pay for measures that will make the property more resilient in the future because they're concerned that they'll invest in improving that property and then next time the insurance is up for renewal, the householder just swaps insurer and somebody else gets the benefit of the investment they've made. But yes, so there are markets for it, but the insurers tend to, whilst it's under warranty, still push it back to warranty. Okay, and I think I just want to remind us that through this process, what we're looking at is the duty of care that we have not only to the client, but also to the ultimate end user and the public. Okay. Any other questions? Good. Okay. That's handy.
That's fantastic, Jerry. Thank you very much.
And more or less on time.
Absolutely spot on.
Okay, thank you very much.
Coffee and still available in the lobby if you'd all like to partake. Thanks, Gordon.
Do I